Hello and welcome to the Vincent Yeomans module of History of the American Musical. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about one of the composers who's not usually listed with the greats. This is no Gershwin or Porter or Sondheim. This is one of the guys that might have been a footnote, if not for an interesting sort of episode in his career, which affects a lot of us here locally, and which it's kind of a pleasure to talk about. Vincent Yeomans was an American theater composer and producer. He was born in New York City. As you can see here, once again, I'm talking about a person without a terribly long life. Vince Yeomans was born in 1898 and passed away due to tuberculosis in 1946. During that time, he was, well, an average kind of competent composer who was determined to have at least one successful Broadway musical. And bless him, but didn't he write a pile of them? He was a Tin Pan Alley song plugger for Harms, one of those companies. Wasn't everybody in this era, right? And composed a lot of songs for Tin Pan Alley. He composed he worked with Ira Gershwin, our lyricist from last time, on some music for a show called Two Little Girls in Blue. He worked with Oscar Hammerstein on a show called Wildflower. You might have noticed these aren't shows you've probably ever heard of before. And Yeomans might not have been remembered very, very well, if not for writing perhaps the single biggest financial success, stage-wise, box office-wise, of the 1920s. And that show is the subject of a story that kind of, well, it affects us all. I hope that you will indulge me. It's one of the rare opportunities that I get to talk to you about two of my favorite things, the history of the American musical and also a little bit of the history of baseball, because this is a local story. And for some of you, this may start to come together as you hear it. Maybe you've heard some of this already. Maybe you need to hear the exact real story about it. But we're going to step aside from Mr. Yeomans for just a second here, and I want to talk to you about somebody else, a man named Harry Frazee. That you may have heard this name. Harry Frazee was born in 1880 and died in 1929, a little bit before the great stock market crash, and is probably best known for two things: for being a businessman and Broadway producer, and also for being the owner for quite some time of the Boston Red Sox. Frazee bought the Boston Red Sox in 1916 for about $500,000. The numbers we're going to talk about here are kind of strange. And I promise, by the way, this comes back to Vincent Yeomans, it comes back to the American musical. Don't worry about that. Frazee, although he was the owner of an athletic team, really wanted to be a Broadway producer. He maintained an office in New York. He maintained all of his connections in the theater world, and just really more than anything else, just said, I want to be involved in the theater. I want to be a part of that. When his family, largely a whole family of very wealthy people, picked up the Red Sox, I guess it was decided that, well, sports is kind of like theater, and maybe you could run this team, and maybe that would be something to kind of answer your interest in this field. And Frazee ran the Red Sox for a few years, and won a World Series title in 1918. In fact, if you would ask like Mark Twain or someone who was alive at the beginning of the 20th century about which baseball team they were tired of seeing win the World Series, they might well have said the Boston Red Sox. They were a very successful team in the 1900s and 19-teens. The Red Sox won the very first World Series. Technically, they won a World Series before that, by the way, when the other team refused to show up. And they just kind of declared victory because the National League and American League at that time did not have a mutually, they weren't really one organization, and they kind of had some mutual suspicion of one another, and they didn't know if it would be bad for business to have one of those teams second to the other as far as a world champion. In any case, you may be starting to piece together what's important here. The Red Sox had under their employ up until the year 1918 an outfielder named George Herman Ruth. Babe Ruth was everything you've read about and more. He lived life as an enormous id, as a giant out of control, eating 4 and 5 meals a day, smoking multiple cigars, going out and drinking and partying with all kinds of girls, and somehow still managed to revolutionize the sport of baseball. In fact, probably to save the sport, because right before he began his tear of home runs, which runs in the early days of baseball were almost considered gauche, you know? You played what they call the dead ball era. You were trying to just move hitters around the bases one at a time, score a lot lower than, and you know, you have to go get a new ball. You know, it's kind of like, oh, but Ruth changed all that because he proved the home run itself was pretty exciting, and set a record that stood for many years, up until a certain steroid-filled individual changed those books. But for Mr. Ruth, inexplicably, he became, even though he was this enormously heavy-set kind of big child, he became a huge star. The Red Sox had him not as an outfielder, though, but as a pitcher. In fact, Babe Ruth held several records as a Red Sox pitcher in World Series action and things like that. And Harry Frazee was happy enough, but also Mr. Ruth had a lot of demands. He wanted to be a manager at one point. He wanted a lot more money, as anyone who has a successful career. And so he was going to have to negotiate with him anyway. Another person I get to tell you a little bit about here is a man named Colonel Jacob Ruppert, who has about very similar lifespan from 1867 to 1939. Colonel Jacob Ruppert, well, he wasn't really in the Army or a colonel. He just let people call him that because he had this very, you know, almost, you know, this regal sort of way about him, and people referred to him as the colonel. The colonel had a business. He was in the brewery business. He had a lot of bottled beer. Now, around 1919, the law of the land in the United States changed, and as you know, prohibition came about, which put a lot of folks like Mr. Ruppert in a lot of danger. He had enough connections in Washington and elsewhere that they said to him, Colonel, your major business, beer, is going to be is going to take a serious hit. You should diversify. You better sink some money into some of the other things that you own so that they start to stand up a little bit and you're not hit so hard. Some companies, like the International Brewing Company, IBC, stopped making beer and started making root beer, and kept making root beer ever since. For Jacob Ruppert, he happened to also own a small team that was originally called the Highlanders, and eventually also was renamed the New York Yankees. And they were not a terribly good team. They were not consistent. They didn't have any big stars. He also happened to have a friendship with Mr. Frazee. Okay, Harry Frazee finds out that he might have the opportunity to do the Broadway thing that he's always wanted to do, and that he has this asset, the Boston Red Sox. Now, the short story, the legend that you're going to be kind of familiar with perhaps, is Harry Frazee sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees, owned by Jacob Ruppert, so that he could pay for a production of No No Nanette, so that it would be a very successful show and that he could finally make his name as a Broadway producer. That's sort of the simple version of the story, and it's not entirely accurate, although it's close. It's a really good kind of broad stroke definition of this great scandal. What really happened was this. Frazee not only sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees, Frazee sold the Yankees about 6 or 7 other major players, including some future Hall of Famers. He sold off the manager. He sold off some of the equipment. He even had a point where the New York Yankees held a mortgage on Fenway Park itself and were technically the landlords of Fenway Park for about 3 years. Whenever he would get that, he would ask to be rewarded not with other players, as sometimes people do in sports with trades, but with cash. And he would take that cash, and rather than sink it into improving the park or improving the team, he would sink it into his Broadway productions, like No No Nanette. And over the years, from about 1918 until 2004, the Red Sox sank into a serious decline. Other people argue that World War I and II with the draft, cost a lot of people out of a lot of major cities, including Boston. Many people argue that the Red Sox were mismanaged. Some people argue that it's just sort of fake, and that the idea of one person like Babe Ruth can't just shake his fist and say, I hope you never win. That's a little bit superstitious. It's more likely, however, that Frazee, as the owner of the Red Sox, was just a lousy owner and was really not it was not a priority for him to sink this kind of money. Now, No No Nanette, a musical, opened in 1925. It's a long time after the sale of Ruth, and the Red Sox win the World Series in 18, they sell Ruth in 19. Ruth's explosion of home runs is something that baseball welcomes, because also in 1919, we have a scandal in Chicago where the Chicago White Sox voluntarily lost the World Series on purpose. They were paid to do so by a syndicate of gamblers who bet on the other team. And everybody made a pile of money, it became a scandal. The fact that Ruth took off and became such a big star, and perhaps needed a base like New York, the place, may have saved the sport in that respect, because the attention was drawn a little bit. The investigation of the Black Sox scandal would go on for a couple of years. It's also not like squarely in 1919. The Ruth sale kind of cemented, though, this Red Sox-Yankee kind of alliance. It's kind of ironic. And Frazee actually at one point stopped paying installments because he was, there were some technicalities with who owned Boston's share of some settlements with another, some very complicated business with another league called the Federal League. Harry Frazee gets kind of a bum rap in some respects, but he wasn't a terrible producer, I will say that. Which brings me to No No Nanette, which brings me to the show. Now, although the Nanette musical opened in 1925, and Ruth was sold in 1919, there was another show called My Lady Friends, a non-musical, a play that opened in 1920, bankrolled by Mr. Frazee, probably paid for by the sale of Babe Ruth. And My Lady Friends, its plot and its script would eventually have songs added to it and be reworked and changed into a musical called No No Nanette, which would open in 1925. No No Nanette is an extraordinarily cotton candy, silly kind of piece when you think about it. It's one of the sillier musicals. It's certainly not Showboat or Porgy and Bess. It doesn't even pretend to have a deep meaning or try to enact social justice or any of that. And perhaps with the muscle of Frazee's money behind it, not only in producing it, but in promoting it, in advertising it, No No Nanette was an enormous financial success. It kind of gave birth to the idea of a touring cast for a Broadway musical. It's one of the first to do that. It was one of the first to take its show outside of America and to have multiple casts cast in the roles to cover, being able to perform more performances of the show. It was successfully revived in the 1970s as a camp piece, whereas everything about it that was done with utter sincerity in its rather silly plot was played for comedy and kind of became a big hit all over again in 1971. The music for No No Nanette, Vincent Yeomans, and that kind of is where Yeomans and this story of Frazee, it is where they tie together, and Vincent Yeomans is known as the composer of this production. We're going to take a pause right here, and I'll be talking to you in our next unit a little bit about No No Nanette itself, the plot, the production, what went into putting it together, why it's historically significant, and all of that. So that'll be in our second part, and you'll be able to click on that right after this link here. Thanks so much.